The morning of April 12, 1998, dawned bright and clear over the small town of Millbrook, Tennessee. Sarah Beth Collins, 18 years old with honey blonde hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold, stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for her baptism. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the delicate silver cross necklace around her neck, a gift from her grandmother on her 16th birthday. "This is it, Lord," she whispered to her reflection, her blue eyes shining with anticipation. "Today, I give my whole life to you." The cross pendant caught the morning light streaming through her lace curtains, casting tiny rainbows across the walls of her childhood bedroom. It was a beautiful piece, intricately designed with tiny engravings of Bible verses around the edges, and Sarah Beth had never taken it off since the day she received it. The necklace had become a symbol of her growing faith, and wearing it on her baptism day felt like completing a sacred circle. Downstairs, the aroma of her mother's famous buttermilk pancakes filled the house. Margaret Collins hummed softly as she worked in the kitchen, occasionally glancing toward the staircase with a smile that mixed joy with maternal worry. Her only daughter was about to publicly declare her faith, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about Sarah Beth lately. A distance in her eyes, a hesitation in her voice when she spoke about the future. "Sarah Beth, honey, breakfast is ready," Margaret called, her voice carrying the gentle drawl of someone who had lived in Tennessee all her life. Sarah Beth descended the stairs, her white dress flowing around her like angel wings. The cross necklace caught the light again as she moved, drawing her mother's attention to the precious heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of Collins women. "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, pulling her daughter into a warm embrace. "Grandma Collins would be so proud to see you wearing her cross on this special day." "I can feel her with me," Sarah Beth replied softly, touching the pendant. "It's like she's watching over me, making sure I'm ready for this step." Her father, Robert Collins, entered the kitchen carrying his worn leather Bible, the same one he had used when he served as a deacon at Millbrook Baptist Church. His weathered face, marked by years of honest work at the local lumber mill, beamed with paternal pride as he looked at his daughter. "My little girl, taking her most important step in faith," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Pastor Williams is going to do a beautiful ceremony for you today." The family sat together for what would unknowingly be their last breakfast as a complete unit. They joined hands around the kitchen table, and Robert led them in prayer, thanking God for Sarah Beth's decision to follow Christ and asking for his blessing on the day ahead. The morning sunlight streamed through the gingham curtains, illuminating the scene with an almost ethereal glow that would forever be etched in her parents' memories. "Lord, we thank you for bringing our Sarah Beth to this moment," Robert prayed, his calloused hands gentle as they held his daughter's. "We ask that you guide her steps today and always, that her faith may be a light to others, and that she may feel your presence in every moment of her life. Amen." "Amen," Sarah Beth whispered, squeezing her parents' hands tighter than usual, as if trying to memorize the feeling of their touch. After breakfast, the Collins family made their way to Millbrook Baptist Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple that had stood at the heart of their community for over a century. The church bells were already ringing, calling the faithful to witness Sarah Beth's baptism, along with 2 other young people from the congregation. As they walked up the front steps of the church, Sarah Beth paused to look back at the town she had known all her life. The tree-lined streets, the familiar houses with their wraparound porches, the distant mountains that cradled their valley, everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow different, through the lens of this momentous day. "Nervous, honey?" Margaret asked, noticing her daughter's hesitation. "A little," Sarah Beth admitted, her hand instinctively moving to touch her cross necklace. "But also excited. I've been waiting for this day for so long." Inside the church, the sanctuary was filled with friends and family members who had come to witness the baptisms. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the walls in brilliant blues, reds, and golds. Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 50s with gentle eyes and a warm smile, greeted each family as they arrived. "Sarah Beth," he said, taking her hands in his own, "are you ready to make this public declaration of your faith in Jesus Christ?" "Yes, Pastor Williams," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The service began with hymns that had echoed through the church for generations. Sarah Beth's clear soprano voice rose above the congregation as they sang "Amazing Grace," her mother's alto harmonizing beautifully beside her. The familiar words took on new meaning as Sarah Beth prepared to publicly declare her transformation, from death to life through Christ. As Pastor Williams began his sermon about baptism as a symbol of death to the old self and resurrection to new life in Christ, Sarah Beth felt a profound sense of peace settling over her. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the years of Sunday school, youth group meetings, and countless conversations with her parents about faith and purpose. "Baptism is not magic," Pastor Williams explained to the congregation, his voice carrying the weight of decades of ministry. "It is an outward sign of an inward change that has already taken place in the heart. When Sarah Beth, Michael, and Jenny go under the water today, they are proclaiming to the world that their old lives are buried with Christ. And when they come up, they are declaring that they have been raised to walk in newness of life." Sarah Beth felt tears forming in her eyes as the pastor's words resonated deep in her soul. She touched her grandmother's cross once more, feeling the weight of generations of faith that had led to this moment. After the sermon, Pastor Williams called the 3 candidates for baptism to come forward. Sarah Beth stood with Michael Henderson, a 17-year-old boy from her youth group, and Jenny Morrison, a 16-year-old who had recently moved to Millbrook with her family. Together, they made their way to the baptistry behind the pulpit, where Pastor Williams was waiting in the waist-deep water. "Sarah Beth Collins," Pastor Williams said as she entered the water, the white fabric of her dress floating around her. "Like lily petals, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he died for your sins and rose again for your salvation?" "I do," Sarah Beth replied, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "Then, based on your confession of faith, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Pastor Williams gently lowered Sarah Beth beneath the surface of the water. For a moment, she was completely submerged, surrounded by silence and the gentle pressure of the water. In that sacred space, she felt the presence of God in a way she had never experienced before, a profound peace that seemed to fill every cell of her being. When she emerged from the water, gasping slightly and blinking droplets from her eyes, the congregation erupted in applause and joyful amens. Her parents were crying tears of joy in the front pew, and Margaret had her hands pressed to her heart, as if trying to contain the overwhelming emotion she felt, watching her daughter take this momentous step. Sarah Beth made her way out of the baptistry, her wet dress clinging to her as she accepted the towel that one of the church ladies offered her. She could feel her grandmother's cross against her skin, the metal slightly warm from the water, and she smiled, thinking about how this precious heirloom had witnessed yet another generation's commitment to faith. After changing into dry clothes, in the church's dressing room, Sarah Beth rejoined her family for the fellowship meal that traditionally followed baptismal services. The church basement was filled with long tables covered in checkered tablecloths, and the air was rich with The aroma of fried chicken, green bean casserole, and homemade biscuits. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," Robert said, pulling his daughter into another hug. "Watching you come up out of that water, I've never seen anything more beautiful." "It felt incredible, Daddy," Sarah Beth replied, her eyes still shining, with the afterglow of the experience, like I was being born all over again. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah Beth found herself surrounded by well-wishers from the congregation. Mrs. Henderson brought her a slice of chocolate cake, and old Mr. Patterson shared a story about his own baptism 60 years earlier. The young people from the youth group gathered around her, excited to hear about her experience and talking about their own plans for future baptisms. Around 4 o'clock, as the fellowship meal was winding down and people were beginning to clear tables and wash dishes, Sarah Beth approached her parents with a request that would haunt them for the next 25 years. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice carrying a note of earnestness that made them both look up from the dishes they were drying. "I'd like to take a walk by myself for a little while. This has been such an overwhelming day, and I just want some quiet. Time to think and pray about everything that's happened." Margaret frowned slightly, her maternal instincts kicking in. "Honey, you've been through a lot today. Why don't you just rest at home? You can have all the quiet time you need in your room." "Please, Mom," Sarah Beth said, touching her mother's arm gently. "I know it might seem strange, but I feel like God is calling me to spend some time alone with Him. Just a short walk to process everything. I promise I'll be home before dark." Robert and Margaret exchanged glances, having one of those wordless conversations that married couples perfect over years of partnership. They could see the sincerity in their daughter's eyes, the genuine desire for solitude that often follows. Profound spiritual experiences. "Where were you thinking of walking?" Robert asked, though he was already beginning to nod his agreement. "Just around town, maybe up toward Miller's Ridge," Sarah Beth replied. "The view up there always helps me think clearly. I'll stay on the main paths, and I'll be careful." Miller's Ridge was a popular hiking area about a mile outside of town, known for its scenic overlooks and well-maintained trails. It was considered safe, and many townspeople used it for evening walks and weekend family outings. "All right," Margaret said reluctantly, "but you take your father's cell phone and—" "You call us every hour to check in. And you be home before 6 o'clock, no later." "Thank you," Sarah Beth said, kissing both her parents on the cheek. "I love you both so much. This has been the most perfect day of my life." Those would be the last words Margaret and Robert Collins would ever hear their daughter speak. Sarah Beth left the church basement, still wearing the casual clothes she had changed into after her baptism: jeans, a light blue sweater, and her favorite walking shoes. Around her neck, her grandmother's cross caught the late afternoon sunlight as she stepped outside, creating tiny sparkles of light that seemed to dance around her as she walked. She waved goodbye to her parents through the church window and set off toward Miller's Ridge, her step light and her heart full of the joy that comes from knowing you are exactly where God wants you to be. Several people from the congregation saw her walking down Main Street, and all would later testify that she looked happy and peaceful, not at all like someone planning to disappear. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah Beth Collins was at 4:47 p.m. when old Tom Fletcher saw her turning onto the trail that led up Miller's Ridge. He later told police that she had waved at him cheerfully and that she appeared to be humming or singing softly to herself. When 6 o'clock came and went without any word from Sarah Beth, Margaret Collins began to worry. When 7 o'clock passed with no phone call, Robert grabbed his truck keys and headed for Miller's Ridge. When 8 o'clock arrived and Sarah Beth still hadn't come home, Margaret called the police. The search began immediately. Sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and dozens of church members scoured Miller's Ridge and the surrounding areas with flashlights and search dogs. They found no trace of Sarah Beth Collins, no footprints leaving the main trail, no signs of struggle, no discarded clothing or personal belongings. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The only thing the searchers found was something that made Margaret Collins sink to her knees in the middle of the forest trail, sobbing. A single thread from Sarah Beth's light blue sweater caught on a thorny bush about halfway up the ridge. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No trail, no clues, no answers. Just the echo of hymns from that morning's baptism service, haunting the mountain air as darkness fell over Millbrook, Tennessee. The first few weeks after Sarah Beth's disappearance passed in a blur of police interviews, search parties, and desperate hope. Margaret Collins barely slept, starting awake at every sound, convinced she heard her daughter's voice calling from the yard. Robert threw himself into the search efforts with the intensity of a man fighting for his very soul, spending every daylight hour combing through the forests and mountains surrounding Millbrook. The FBI was called in after the local sheriff's department exhausted their resources. Agent Patricia Henley, a specialist in missing persons cases, set up a command center in the Millbrook Community Center and began the methodical process of investigating every aspect of Sarah Beth's life. She interviewed friends, teachers, youth group leaders, and distant relatives, searching for any hint of why an 18-year-old girl would disappear on what should have been the happiest day of her life. "I need you to think carefully," Agent Henley said during one of many interviews with Sarah Beth's best friend, Katie Morrison, Jenny's older sister. Had Sarah Beth seemed different lately? Worried about anything? Mentioned any problems? Katie twisted her hands in her lap, her eyes red from crying. "She seemed so happy about the baptism," she said slowly. "If anything, she'd been more at peace lately than I'd seen her in months. She kept talking about how she felt like God had a special plan for her life." The investigation revealed that Sarah Beth had been an exemplary student, beloved by her teachers and popular with her classmates. She had never been in trouble, never experimented with drugs or alcohol, and had never given her parents any reason to worry about her behavior. She had been accepted to Tennessee State University for the fall semester and had been excited about studying elementary education so she could become a teacher. "There's no evidence of foul play," Agent Henley explained to the Collins family after 6 weeks of intensive investigation. No signs of struggle, no suspicious vehicles reported in the area, no one with any motive to harm Sarah Beth. But there's also no evidence that she left voluntarily. Her bank account hasn't been touched, her belongings are all still in her room, and she left without taking anything with her. Margaret Collins, who had lost 20 pounds and developed deep circles under her eyes, looked up at the agent with desperate hope. "So you're not giving up? You'll keep looking?" "We'll follow up on any new leads that come in," Agent Henley replied gently, though her expression said what her words did not. After 6 weeks with no trace, the chances of finding Sarah Beth alive were diminishing rapidly. As months turned into years, the case grew cold. New missing persons reports demanded attention, other crimes required investigation, and gradually the FBI's active search for Sarah Beth Collins was relegated to a file cabinet in a windowless office in Nashville. But Margaret and Robert Collins never stopped searching. Robert retired early from the lumber mill and spent his days driving the back roads of Tennessee, stopping at every small town, every truck stop, every place where someone might have seen his daughter. He carried a folder of photographs everywhere. He went, showing Sarah Beth's picture to cashiers and waitresses, mechanics and store clerks, anyone who would look. Margaret contacted every organization she could find that helped locate missing persons. She learned how to use the internet, creating websites and social media pages dedicated to finding Sarah Beth. She appeared on local television shows every anniversary of the disappearance, pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. The church community rallied around the Collins family for the first few years, organizing prayer vigils and fundraisers to support the search efforts. But as time passed and no new information emerged, Even the most devoted friends began to accept that Sarah Beth Collins was probably never coming home. Pastor Williams, who had baptized Sarah Beth on that fateful April day, struggled with his own crisis of faith as he watched the family he loved slowly disintegrate under the weight of their grief. He had officiated at Robert's funeral after a heart attack claimed him in 2008, 10 years after Sarah Beth's disappearance. He had held Margaret's hand at the graveside as she whispered brokenly that she couldn't understand why God would take both her husband and her daughter from her. Maybe he didn't take them, Pastor Williams had replied gently. Maybe he's holding them for you until you can all be together again. Margaret Collins lived alone in the house where she had raised Sarah Beth, keeping her daughter's room exactly as it had been on the morning of the baptism. The white dress still hung in the closet, and Sarah Beth's high school yearbooks were still stacked neatly on the desk. Margaret continued to buy Christmas presents for Sarah Beth every year, wrapping them carefully and placing them under the tree, just in case this was the year her daughter came home. The 10th anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance brought renewed media attention. A documentary crew came to Millbrook to film a segment for a television show about unsolved mysteries. They interviewed Margaret, now in her 60s and noticeably frail, as she sat in Sarah Beth's bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of her daughter's truncated life. "I know she's still alive," Margaret said to the camera, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "A mother knows these things. If my Sarah Beth were dead, I would feel it in my heart. She's out there somewhere, and someday she's going to come home." The documentary aired on a national network and generated hundreds of tips and supposed sightings. Margaret Collins followed up on every single one, driving hundreds of miles to investigate claims that someone had seen a young woman who might be Sarah Beth. Each lead ended in disappointment, but Margaret never lost hope. "Faith is believing in things you cannot see," she would tell anyone who suggested it might be time to accept that Sarah Beth was gone. "I have faith that God is taking care of my daughter, wherever she is." By the 15th anniversary, the media attention had largely faded. New missing persons cases captured public interest, and Sarah Beth Collins became just another entry in the database of the vanished. Margaret continued her solitary vigil, aging gracefully but never abandoning her conviction that her daughter would return. The 20th anniversary passed quietly. Pastor Williams, now in his 70s, held a special prayer service at Millbrook Baptist Church. About 30 people attended, mostly older church members who remembered Sarah Beth and wanted to show support for Margaret. The baptistry where Sarah Beth had been submerged on that long-ago April morning stood empty, but Margaret swore she could still see the ripples her daughter had made when she emerged from the water, reborn in Christ. As Margaret Collins approached her 70th birthday, she began to slow down noticeably. The daily drives to search for Sarah Beth became weekly trips, then monthly outings. Her arthritis made it difficult to handle the heavy folders of photographs and missing person flyers, but she never stopped believing. "I won't die until I know what happened to my Sarah Beth," she told her doctor during a routine checkup. "God won't take me home until he shows me where she is." Dr. Reynolds, who had known the Collins family for decades, didn't have the heart to tell Margaret that her body was showing signs of the stress and heartbreak she had carried for more than 2 decades. Her blood pressure was dangerously high. Her weight had dropped to an alarming level, and she showed signs of the depression that often accompanies prolonged grief. The 23rd anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance fell on a rainy Sunday. Margaret Collins sat alone in the front pew of Millbrook Baptist Church, the same pew where she had watched her daughter's baptism with such joy 23 years earlier. Pastor Williams had retired the year before, and the new pastor, a young Man named David Hayes struggled to find words of comfort for a woman who had endured loss beyond imagination. "Mrs. Collins," Pastor Hayes said after the service, sitting beside her in the empty sanctuary, "I know this day is always hard for you. Is there anything I can do? Anyone I can call?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes fixed on the baptistry. "I'd just like to sit here sometimes and remember," she said softly. "This is where I last saw her truly happy, before everything went wrong." "Tell me about that day," Pastor Hayes said gently. "I've heard pieces of the story, but I'd like to hear it from you." For the next hour, Margaret Collins relived every detail of April 12th, 1998. She described the morning sunlight in Sarah Beth's hair, the way her daughter's eyes had shone with joy as she came up from the baptismal water, the sound of her laughter during the fellowship meal. She talked about the cross necklace that Sarah Beth had worn that day, her grandmother's silver cross with its intricate engravings and tiny Bible verses. "She never took that necklace off," Margaret said, touching her own throat where an identical cross hung, her grandmother's twin to the one Sarah Beth had worn. "Even when she was swimming or playing sports, she always wore that cross. If someone found her," her voice broke slightly, "they would know it belonged to her. It was unique, handmade by a jeweler in Nashville back in the 1940s. Pastor Hayes listened with the patience of a man called to bear others' burdens. He had heard similar stories from other grieving families, but there was something about Margaret Collins's unwavering faith that moved him deeply. After 23 years without answers, she still believed that God had a plan, that there was a reason for her suffering, that someday she would understand. As the 24th anniversary approached, Margaret Collins began to have a recurring dream. In the dream, she was standing at the edge of a deep well, looking down into dark water. At the bottom of the well, something silver glittered in the sunlight. In the dream, she always reached toward the light, but could never quite grasp it before waking up. "It's the strangest thing," she told her neighbor, Ellen Patterson, over coffee one morning. "The dream is so vivid, so real. I can feel the cool air rising from the well, smell the mineral scent of the water, and that silver light at the bottom, it calls to me like it's trying to tell me something." Ellen, whose husband had been part of the original search party 24 years earlier, listened with concern. Margaret had been having more episodes of confusion lately, moments where she seemed to be living in the past rather than the present. The doctor had mentioned that prolonged grief could sometimes manifest in unusual ways. "Maybe it's just your mind processing everything you've been through," Ellen suggested gently. "Dreams can be our subconscious way of working through unresolved feelings." But Margaret shook her head firmly. "This isn't just a dream, Ellen. This is God trying to show me something. I've been praying for 24 years for a sign, for some indication of what happened to my Sarah Beth. I think He's finally ready to give me an answer." The dream continued every night for weeks as the anniversary approached. Each time, Margaret could see the silver light more clearly, could make out what looked like delicate engravings on the metallic surface. She began to believe with growing certainty that she was seeing Sarah Beth's cross necklace at the bottom of a well somewhere in the mountains around Millbrook. "Mrs. Collins," Pastor Hayes said when Margaret shared her conviction with him, "I don't want to discourage your faith, but dreams can sometimes be wishful thinking rather than divine revelation. After all these years of searching, perhaps your mind is creating the closure you need." "No," Margaret replied with quiet conviction. "I know the difference between hope and revelation. God is showing me where she is. I just need to find the right well." On April 10th, 2023, 2 days before the 25th anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance, Margaret Collins woke up with absolute certainty about what she needed to do. The dream had been clearer than ever before, and this time she had seen not just the silver cross at the bottom of the well, but the surrounding landscape as well. She drove her aging sedan through the winding mountain roads of Tennessee, following an internal compass that seemed to be guiding her toward a truth that had been hidden for a quarter of a century. She passed familiar landmarks, the church where Sarah Beth had been baptized, the trailhead where she had last been seen, the overlook, where so many search parties had gathered over the years. But this time, Margaret felt drawn to a part of Miller's Ridge that had rarely been searched, a remote area where old homesteads had crumbled into ruin and abandoned wells dotted the landscape like forgotten eyes staring up at heaven. As she drove deeper into the mountains, Margaret Collins whispered a prayer that had sustained her for 25 years. "Lord, if it's your will, show me where my daughter is. Give me the peace of knowing, whatever the truth might be." She had no idea that by sunset that day, her prayer would finally be answered. Margaret Collins parked her car on a narrow dirt road that wound through what had once been the thriving mountain community of Cedar Hollow. In the early 1900s, this area had been home to several farming families, but by the 1960s, most of the homesteads had been abandoned as people moved to larger towns for work. Now, only crumbling foundations and overgrown wells remained as testaments to the families who had once called this place home. Margaret stepped out of her car, feeling her arthritis protest against the damp mountain air. At 70 years old, she was not equipped for hiking through rough terrain, but something deeper than physical comfort was driving her forward. She had brought a flashlight, a bottle of water, and her cell phone. Though she knew there was no signal this deep in the mountains, the landscape matched her dream with eerie precision. Gnarled oak trees twisted skyward from rocky soil, and mountain laurel bloomed in brilliant pink clusters among the ruins of old stone walls. Margaret walked carefully through the undergrowth, following what appeared to be an old footpath that connected the scattered homesteads. She found the first well after 20 minutes of walking. It was a traditional stone well, partially covered by a wooden cap that had rotted through in several places. Margaret approached it cautiously, pulling out her flashlight and peering down into the darkness below. The beam of light revealed still water about 20 feet down, but nothing else. This wasn't the well from her dream. The second well was deeper in the woods, hidden by a thick stand of rhododendron bushes. This one had no covering at all, just a circular opening rimmed with carefully laid stones. Margaret's flashlight showed dry earth at the bottom. This well had been abandoned so long that even the water table had shifted away from it. As she made her way toward what she hoped would be a third well, Margaret began to question her certainty. Perhaps Pastor Hayes had been right. Perhaps she was allowing her desperate hope to override common sense. After 25 years of searching, was she really going to find answers by following a dream through abandoned mountain hollows? But then she saw it, a glint of metal among a cluster of wild roses that had grown up around the ruins of an old cabin. As she pushed through the thorny bushes, heedless of the scratches on her arms, Margaret saw the well that had haunted her dreams for weeks. This well was different from the others. The stone rim was more carefully crafted, with what appeared to be decorative carving around the edge. A heavy wooden cover lay beside the opening, as if someone had removed it recently and hadn't bothered to replace it. Margaret approached the well with her heart pounding, certain that she was about to see something that would change everything. She turned on her flashlight and leaned carefully over the stone rim, directing the beam down into the depths below. The well was deep, perhaps 30 feet, and filled with clear water that reflected the light back up like a mirror. For a moment, Margaret saw nothing but her own reflection wavering in the dark water far below. Then she adjusted the angle of the flashlight, and her breath caught in her throat. There, at the bottom of the well, resting on what appeared to be a ledge of stone about 2 feet above the water level, was a glint of silver. Even from 30 feet away, Margaret could see the distinctive shape and the fine engravings that caught the light. She knew without a doubt that she was looking at her grandmother's cross necklace, the same necklace that Sarah Beth had worn on the day of her baptism 25 years ago. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, sinking to her knees beside the well. "Oh my precious Lord, you've shown me where she is." Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled for her cell phone, even though she knew there was no signal this deep in the mountains. She would have to drive back toward town to call for help, but she couldn't bear to leave the well now that she had finally found it. What if someone came and moved the evidence before she could return with the authorities? Instead, she decided to try to get a better look at what was down there. The cross was clearly visible, but Margaret needed to know if there were other signs that Sarah Beth had been in this place. She found a rock and dropped it into the well, listening to the sound as it hit the water to gauge the depth more accurately. The stone took nearly 3 seconds to hit the water, confirming that the well was indeed very deep. But as the ripples from the impact spread across the surface, Margaret's flashlight beam illuminated something else on the stone ledge where the cross was resting. What appeared to be fabric, the remnants of clothing that had been preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the stone ledge above the waterline. Margaret strained her eyes to make out the details, and her heart lurched as she recognized what looked like pieces of light blue material. The sweater, Sarah Beth's light blue sweater that she had been wearing when she disappeared. Margaret Collins had found more than just her daughter's necklace. She had found the place where Sarah Beth had died. With shaking hands, Margaret took several photographs with her cell phone, making sure to capture clear images of the cross and the fabric remnants. The camera flash illuminated the well's depths more clearly than her flashlight, and in those brief moments of stark illumination, Margaret saw other details that made her gasp. Scattered among the fabric were what appeared to be small white objects, too uniform to be stones, too numerous to be accidental. Margaret realized with growing horror that she was looking at bones. Human bones that had been separated and scattered over the 25 years since Sarah Beth's disappearance. Fighting against the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her, Margaret forced herself to take more photographs and to study the scene as carefully as possible. She needed to be able to describe everything to the police when she called them. After a quarter-century of searching, she owed it to Sarah Beth to be thorough and accurate in documenting what she had found. As she examined the well more closely, Margaret noticed something that chilled her to the bone. The wooden cover that lay beside the opening wasn't weathered and aged like the abandoned wells she had seen earlier. This cover looked much newer, and there were scratches in the wood that suggested it had been moved recently, within the last few years, not decades. Someone had been maintaining this well. Someone had been checking on Sarah Beth's remains. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her daughter hadn't simply fallen into an abandoned well and died tragically. Sarah Beth had been murdered, and her body had been deliberately hidden in this remote location. Even worse, someone had been returning to this place over the years, ensuring that the secret remained buried. Margaret looked around the clearing with new eyes, noting details that her initial excitement had caused her to miss. The path she had followed to reach this spot was more defined than it should have been if the area were truly abandoned. Someone had been walking this route regularly. The wild roses around the well had been trimmed back recently, as if to provide easier access to the opening. Most disturbing of all, there were tire tracks in the soft earth near the old cabin ruins. Tracks that looked fresh enough to have been made within the last few months. Margaret Collins realized that she might not be alone in these mountains. Whoever had killed Sarah Beth 25 years ago might still be coming to this place. And if they discovered that their secret had been found, Margaret might not make it out of the mountains alive. With sudden urgency, Margaret gathered her belongings and hurried back toward her car. She needed to reach a place where her cell phone would work so she could call the police. But as she made her way through the undergrowth, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The woods, which had seemed peaceful and welcoming when she arrived, now felt ominous and threatening. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, every call of a mountain bird made her jump. Margaret found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the trees behind her. When she finally reached her car, Margaret locked the doors immediately and sat for a moment trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were still shaking as she started the engine and began the drive back toward civilization and cell phone coverage. About halfway down the mountain, her phone began to receive a signal. Margaret pulled over at the first safe spot and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. My name is Margaret Collins, she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. I need to report that I've found my daughter's remains. She's been missing for 25 years, and I've just discovered where she was killed. Ma'am, can you tell me your location? Margaret gave her location as precisely as she could, describing the route she had taken to reach the well and providing landmarks that emergency responders could use to find the site. Are you in immediate danger, Mrs. Collins? The dispatcher asked. Margaret hesitated before answering. I don't think so, but whoever killed my daughter has been returning to the site where her body is hidden. I saw evidence that someone has been maintaining the location recently. Ma'am, I need you to drive to a safe, public location and wait for officers to meet you there. Do not return to the site under any circumstances. I understand, Margaret replied. I'm heading to the Millbrook Diner on Main Street. It's a public place where I'll be safe. 20 minutes later, Margaret Collins sat in a corner booth at the Millbrook Diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she waited for the police to arrive. The familiar surroundings of the diner where she had eaten countless meals over the years seemed surreal after what she had just discovered. How could the world continue to look so normal when everything had just changed forever? Sheriff Jake Morrison, Jenny Morrison's younger brother, who had grown up to follow in his father's footsteps in law enforcement, arrived with Detective Linda Hayes, a specialist in cold cases who had recently been assigned to the county sheriff's department. Both officers had known the Collins family for years and understood the significance of Margaret's call. Mrs. Collins, Sheriff Morrison said gently as he slid into the booth across from her, I need you to tell me exactly what you found up there, and I need you to tell me how you came to be searching in that particular location. Margaret took a deep breath and began her story, starting with the recurring dreams that had plagued her. For weeks, leading up to the 25th anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance, she described the well in detail. The cross necklace she had seen at the bottom, the fabric remnants, and the bone fragments scattered on the stone ledge. You're certain it was Sarah Beth's cross? Detective Hayes asked, taking careful notes. Absolutely certain, Margaret replied, pulling out her own cross necklace to show them. This was my grandmother's, and Sarah Beth's was identical to it. They were made by the same jeweler in Nashville in the 1940s. See these tiny engravings around the edge, and this particular pattern of Bible verses. There's no way it could be anyone else's necklace. Margaret showed them the photographs she had taken with her cell phone. Even in the poor lighting and at the distance from which they were taken, the distinctive shape and detailing of the cross were clearly visible. Mrs. Collins, Sheriff Morrison said carefully, I have to ask you this, and I hope you understand why. Is there any possibility that you might have misinterpreted what you saw after 25 years of searching and given the emotional significance of the anniversary? Margaret fixed the sheriff with a steady gaze that reminded him exactly why she had never given up hope for all these years. Sheriff Morrison, I am 70 years old, but I am not senile and I am not delusional. I know what I saw. My daughter's body is at the bottom of that well, and someone has been maintaining the site to keep it hidden. Detective Hayes looked up from her notes. Tell me more about the evidence that someone has been visiting the site recently. Margaret described the fresh tire tracks, the recently trimmed vegetation, and most importantly, the wooden well cover that appeared to be much newer than the abandoned homestead around it. If someone has been returning to check on the site, Detective Hayes said thoughtfully, then we might be dealing with someone who is still in the area, someone who has been living with this secret for 25 years. Sheriff Morrison nodded. Grimly, we'll need to process this as an active crime scene. I'm calling in the state police and the FBI. This isn't just a recovery of old remains. This could be an ongoing investigation into someone who might still be a threat. Within 2 hours, the quiet mountain roads leading to Cedar Hollow were filled with law enforcement vehicles. The FBI's evidence response team arrived from Nashville with specialized equipment for processing the well site. State police officers established a perimeter around the area to preserve evidence and to ensure that no one could approach undetected. Margaret Collins was asked to return to the site to show investigators exactly where she had made her discovery, but she was instructed to remain a safe distance from the well while the experts did their work. As she watched from the edge of the clearing, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. After 25 years, she was finally going to have answers. She was going to be able to bring Sarah Beth home and give her a proper burial. But seeing the professional efficiency with which the investigators worked, the crime scene tape, the cameras, the methodical documentation of evidence, drove home the reality that her daughter had been murdered. We're going to need specialized equipment to recover the remains safely, Agent Patricia Henley explained to Margaret. Agent Henley was the same FBI investigator who had worked Sarah Beth's case 25 years earlier, though now she was nearing retirement and had grey hair where once it had been brown. The well is deep, and we can't risk contaminating evidence by lowering someone down on ropes, Agent Henley continued. We're bringing in a pump to lower the water level and a crane system that will allow us to access the stone ledge where the remains are located. Margaret nodded, understanding that the recovery process would take time, but she had waited 25 years for this day. She could wait a few more hours to finally bring her daughter home. As evening approached, the investigators made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the entire team. While examining the area around the well more closely, they found something that had been hidden beneath a pile of carefully arranged stones, near the base of the old cabin ruins. Mrs. Collins, Detective Hayes called to her, her voice tight with excitement and concern. We need you to look at something. Under the stones, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and surprisingly well preserved, was a leather journal. The investigators opened it carefully, revealing pages of handwritten entries dated from 1998, the year of Sarah Beth's disappearance. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It wasn't Sarah Beth's writing, but it was familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. This appears to be some kind of confession, Agent Henley said, scanning the pages quickly. Someone has been documenting what happened here, and they've been returning to write additional entries over the years. The journal contained detailed accounts of how Sarah Beth had been lured to the well site on the day of her baptism, how she had been killed, and how her body had been disposed of in the well. But most disturbing of all were the more recent entries, written just months earlier, in which the author expressed growing anxiety about the approaching 25th anniversary and the possibility that renewed attention might lead to the discovery of the body. We're going to need to analyze this handwriting and compare it to samples from people who were in Sarah Beth's life, Detective Hayes said. This journal is going to be the key to solving this case. As Margaret listened to the investigators discuss their plans for processing the evidence, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Someone she had known, someone she had trusted, someone who had been part of the Millbrook community for the past 25 years, had killed her daughter and had been living among them ever since. The killer had attended church services where Margaret grieved for her lost child. They had participated in search parties, pretending to help look for Sarah Beth while knowing exactly where her body was hidden. They had offered comfort and support to the Collins family while carrying the secret of their crime. "Mrs. Collins," Sheriff Morrison said gently, "I think you should go home now and try to get some rest. We'll continue working through the night, and we'll call you as soon as we have more information." Margaret nodded, though she knew that sleep would be impossible. After 25 years of questions, she was finally going to have answers. But those answers were going to shatter everything she thought she knew about her community and the people she had trusted. As she drove home through the darkening mountains, Margaret Collins whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for finally finding Sarah Beth, mixed with a prayer for strength to face whatever truths were about to be revealed. She had no idea that by morning, those truths would rock the foundation of everything she believed about faith, forgiveness, and the nature of evil in the world. Margaret Collins sat in her living room at dawn, still wearing the clothes she had worn to the mountains the day before. She had not slept at all during the long night, alternating between pacing the floors of her empty house and kneeling in prayer beside Sarah Beth's carefully preserved bedroom. Every few hours, she had called the sheriff's department for updates on the recovery operation, but there had been little new information to share. At 6:47 a.m., her phone rang. Sheriff Morrison's voice was heavy with exhaustion and something else that Margaret couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Collins, we've successfully recovered your daughter's remains," he said gently. "The medical examiner will need to confirm identity through DNA testing, but based on the clothing fragments and the cross necklace, we're confident that we've found Sarah Beth." Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Thank you, Sheriff. I know it wasn't easy work. Ma'am, there's something else. We need you to come down to the station this morning. We've made significant progress analyzing that journal we found, and we have some questions that we need to ask you." Something in the sheriff's tone made Margaret's chest tighten with apprehension. "What kind of questions?" "It would be better if we discuss this in person, Mrs. Collins. Can you be here by 9 o'clock? And Mrs. Collins, you might want to bring someone with you, a friend or family member." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and trying to prepare herself for whatever revelation awaited her. She thought about calling Ellen Patterson, her closest friend and neighbor, but something told her that this conversation with the police was going to require privacy. At exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret walked into the Millbrook Sheriff's Department. She was escorted to a conference room where Sheriff Morrison, Detective Hayes, and Agent Henley were waiting with serious expressions and a stack of documents spread across the table. "Mrs. Collins, please sit down," Agent Henley said. "We have some difficult information to share with you, and we want to make sure you're prepared for what we're about to tell you." Margaret sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been preparing for 25 years to hear the truth about what happened to my Sarah Beth. Whatever it is, I can handle it." Detective Hayes opened the leather journal and turned it so that Margaret could see the handwriting on the open page. "Mrs. Collins, do you recognize this handwriting?" Margaret studied the careful cursive script for a long moment. There was something familiar about the formation of the letters, the particular way certain words were shaped, but she couldn't quite place where she had seen it before. "It seems familiar," she said slowly, "but I can't say for certain whose it is. The journal documents the events of April 12, 1998, in considerable detail," Agent Henley said. "According to what's written here, Sarah Beth was contacted that afternoon by someone she trusted, someone who told her they needed her help with an emergency situation." Margaret felt her heart rate increasing. What kind of emergency? According to the journal, this person told Sarah Beth that there had been an accident at one of the old homesteads in Cedar Hollow. They said someone was injured and needed help, but that the location was too remote for emergency vehicles to reach quickly. Detective Hayes continued reading from the journal. She believed me completely when I told her someone was hurt and needed her help. Sarah Beth was always so trusting, so eager to do good for others. She didn't question why I asked her to meet me at the trailhead instead of going together from town. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Someone she trusted. Who was it? Who wrote this? Sheriff Morrison exchanged glances with the federal agents before answering. Mrs. Collins, we've compared the handwriting in this journal to samples from several people who were close to Sarah Beth. We've found a match. He opened a folder and pulled out several documents, church records, Sunday school attendance sheets, and volunteer schedules from Millbrook Baptist Church. All bore the same careful, cursive handwriting that filled the pages of the confession journal. The person who killed Sarah Beth and has been maintaining her gravesite for 25 years, Agent Henley said gently, is Pastor Williams. Margaret Collins felt the world shift beneath her feet. Pastor Williams, the gentle, kind man who had baptized her daughter, who had officiated at her husband's funeral, who had comforted her through 25 years of grief and uncertainty. The man she had trusted more than anyone else in the world. That's impossible, she whispered. Pastor Williams loved Sarah Beth like she was his own granddaughter. He would never have hurt her. Detective Hayes turned to another section of the journal and began reading aloud. I never intended for it to happen the way it did. When I asked Sarah Beth to meet me at the old homestead, I only wanted to talk to her privately, to convince her to reconsider her plans for college. Margaret looked up sharply. Her plans for college? What about her plans for college? Agent Henley consulted her notes. According to the journal entries, Pastor Williams had become inappropriately attached to Sarah Beth over the months leading up to her baptism. He had convinced himself that God was calling her to remain in Millbrook and work as a secretary at the church, where he could continue to mentor her spiritual development. But Sarah Beth was excited about going to Tennessee State. Margaret protested. She wanted to become a teacher. Pastor Williams knew that. He even wrote her a recommendation letter for her college application. The journal indicates that he wrote the recommendation letter reluctantly, Detective Hayes said. He had hoped that Sarah Beth would change her mind about leaving Millbrook, especially after her baptism. When it became clear that she was still planning to attend college in the fall, he became desperate. Sheriff Morrison opened the journal, drew a particularly disturbing passage, and began to read. I told her that God had revealed to me that her true calling was to stay in Millbrook and serve the church. I explained that her desire for college was a worldly temptation that would lead her away from her faith. When she disagreed with me, when she said that God could use her as a teacher just as well as he could use her as a church secretary, I knew that Satan had already begun to influence her thinking. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. The man she had trusted with her spiritual guidance, the man who had helped her maintain her faith through the darkest period of her life, had killed her daughter because she wouldn't submit to his twisted interpretation of God's will. What happened at the well? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Agent Henley turned to another section of the journal. According to his account, Pastor Williams became increasingly agitated when Sarah Beth refused to accept his guidance. He interpreted her independence as rebellion against God's authority, as expressed through him as her pastor. Detective Hayes continued reading from the journal. When she told me that she would pray about it, but that she felt certain God was calling her to use her gifts as a teacher, I realized that she had been deceived by prideful thinking. I placed my hands on her shoulders to pray over her, to cast out the spirit of rebellion that was leading her astray. Sarah Beth became frightened and tried to pull away from him, Sheriff Morrison said. According to his account, she threatened to tell her parents and other church members about his behavior. Margaret's blood ran cold. So he killed her to keep her quiet? The journal describes it as an accident, Agent Henley said carefully. He claims that he was trying to restrain her from leaving, to force her to listen to what he believed was God's message for her life. In the struggle, she fell backward and struck her head on the stone rim of the well. Detective Hayes read the final chilling passage. When I realized that she was dead, I knew that God was testing my faith. He had removed Sarah Beth from the worldly temptations that would have led her astray, and he was trusting me to handle the situation with wisdom and discretion. I placed her body in the well where she would be safe until the resurrection, and I took her cross necklace as a reminder to pray for her soul daily. Margaret Collins sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of Pastor Williams' betrayal. The man who had comforted her through 25 years of grief had been the cause of that grief. The man who had encouraged her to maintain faith in God's plan had been the instrument of her family's destruction. "Where is he now?" Margaret asked finally. "We arrested him at his home this morning," Sheriff Morrison replied. "He's being held without bond, pending formal charges of murder, obstruction of justice, and abuse of a corpse." "Did he confess?" Agent Henley nodded. When confronted with the journal and the evidence from the well site, he admitted everything. He also returned Sarah Beth's cross necklace, which he had kept hidden in his study for 25 years. A silence fell over the room as Margaret absorbed this information. 25 years of searching, 25 years of wondering, 25 years of trusting the very man who had destroyed her family. "Mrs. Collins," Detective Hayes said gently, "there's one more thing you need to know. Pastor Williams has indicated that he wants to speak with you. He's asked permission to apologize in person." Margaret looked up sharply. "He wants to apologize. After 25 years of lying to my face, after letting me believe that my daughter might still be alive somewhere, after conducting my husband's funeral knowing that he was the reason Robert died of a broken heart, he wants to apologize? You're under no obligation to see him," Sheriff Morrison assured her. "But he has information about Sarah Beth's final moments that isn't in the journal. He claims he wants to give you closure." Margaret Collins stood up slowly, feeling every one of her 70 years weighing on her shoulders. "I need time to think about this. I need time to process everything you've told me." As she prepared to leave the sheriff's department, Agent Henley handed her a small evidence bag containing Sarah Beth's cross necklace. "The lab has finished processing this for evidence. We thought you might want to have it back." Margaret took the bag with trembling hands, looking at the silver cross that had been her grandmother's, then her daughter's, and now was hers again. The metal was tarnished from 25 years of storage, but the intricate engravings were still clearly visible. "Agent Henley," Margaret said as she reached the door, "do you believe his story about it being an accident?" The federal agent considered her answer carefully. "Mrs. Collins, in my experience, when someone spends 25 years creating elaborate cover-ups and maintaining grave sites, their original crime was rarely accidental. But that determination will ultimately be up to a jury." Margaret Collins drove home in a daze, the weight of revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket. When she pulled into her driveway, she saw Ellen Patterson waiting on her front porch, with obvious concern. "Margaret, I heard about the commotion up at Cedar Hollow yesterday," Ellen said, hurrying to meet her friend. "The whole town is buzzing with rumors. What happened up there?" Margaret looked at her oldest friend and realized that she was about to be the bearer of news that would shatter not just her own world, but the faith and trust of an entire community that had believed in Pastor Williams for decades. "Ellen," Margaret said quietly, "I think you'd better come inside. We need to talk." For the next hour, Margaret Collins shared the truth about Sarah Beth's disappearance with her friend, watching as Ellen's face went through the same range of emotions that Margaret had experienced at the sheriff's department: disbelief, horror, anger, and profound sadness. "I can't believe it," Ellen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Pastor Williams baptized my children. He married my daughter. He preached my mother's funeral sermon. How could we have been so wrong about him?" Margaret held her friend's hand as they sat together in the living room, where Margaret had spent 25 years waiting for news about Sarah Beth. "I don't think we were wrong about the man we thought we knew," Margaret said slowly. "I think that man existed alongside something darker that none of us ever saw." As word of Pastor Williams' arrest spread through Millbrook, the small town was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the possibility that someone they had trusted completely could be capable of unspeakable acts. That evening, Margaret Collins sat alone in Sarah Beth's room, holding her daughter's cross necklace and trying to understand how God could allow such betrayal and deception to persist for so long. "Sarah Beth," she whispered to the empty room. "I found you, baby girl. I finally found you. And tomorrow I'm going to face the man who took you away from us. I'm going to look him in the eye and try to understand why." As she prepared for what would be the most difficult conversation of her life, Margaret Collins prayed for strength, for wisdom, and for the grace to find forgiveness even in the face of unforgivable betrayal. The next morning would bring her face to face with Pastor Williams and with the final pieces of a truth that had been hidden for 25 years. Margaret Collins woke before dawn on the morning she was scheduled to meet with Pastor Williams at the county jail. She had spent most of the night in prayer, wrestling with emotions that ranged from rage to heartbreak to a strange kind of relief that the long search was finally over. She dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that she had worn to church countless times over the years, the same church where Pastor Williams had preached for nearly 3 decades. As she fastened Sarah Beth's cross necklace around her throat, Margaret felt her daughter's presence more strongly than she had in years, as if Sarah Beth were giving her the strength to face this final confrontation. Sheriff Morrison met Margaret at the jail entrance and escorted her through the security procedures. As they walked down the corridor lined with holding cells, Margaret could hear the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. "Mrs. Collins," Sheriff Morrison said quietly as they approached the interview room, "remember that you can leave at any time. If this becomes too overwhelming, just give me a signal and we'll end the meeting immediately." Margaret nodded, though. She knew that nothing could be more overwhelming than the 25 years of uncertainty she had already endured. Pastor Williams was already seated at a metal table in the small interview room, his hands folded in front of him and his head bowed. He looked much older than his 72 years, with deep lines etched in his face and grey hair that had turned almost completely white. When he looked up as Margaret entered the room, she saw that his eyes were red from crying. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would want to see me." Margaret took the seat across from him, studying the face of the man she had trusted more than anyone else in the world. She had expected to feel overwhelming anger when she saw him, but instead she felt a strange sort of numbness, as if she were looking at a stranger wearing Pastor Williams' face. "I came because I need to understand," Margaret said quietly. "I need to hear from you what really happened to my daughter." Pastor Williams closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. "Margaret, I want you to know that not a day has passed in 25 years that I haven't regretted what happened. Not a single day." "But you let me suffer," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "You let me believe that Sarah Beth might still be alive somewhere. You comforted me through my grief when you were the cause of it." "No," Pastor Williams whispered. "I know how terrible that was. I told myself that I was helping you maintain hope, that it was better for you to have hope than to know the truth. But I was really just protecting myself." Sheriff Morrison, who was observing the meeting from a corner of the room, leaned forward slightly. This was the first time Pastor Williams had admitted to deliberately deceiving Margaret about Sarah Beth's fate. "Tell me what happened that day," Margaret said. "Tell me the truth about my daughter's last moments." Pastor Williams was quiet for several seconds, gathering his thoughts. When he began to speak, his voice was barely audible. "Sarah Beth was so beautiful that day after her baptism," he said. "She was glowing with joy and faith, and I felt like God had placed her in my care for a special purpose." Margaret felt her stomach clench, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "Over the months leading up to her baptism, I had been praying about Sarah Beth's future, and I became convinced that God was calling her to stay in Millbrook and serve our church. I thought that her desire to go to college was a temptation, a worldly ambition that would lead her away from her true calling." "So you decided to interfere with her plans," Margaret said. Pastor Williams nodded miserably. "I called her that afternoon and told her that there had been an accident at one of the old homesteads, that someone was hurt and needed help. I knew she would come immediately. Sarah Beth never could ignore someone in need. You deliberately lied to get her to an isolated location." "Yes," Pastor Williams admitted. "I wanted to talk to her privately, away from her parents and friends, who I thought were encouraging her worldly ambitions. I thought if I could just explain to her what God was really calling her to do, she would understand." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his face. "What happened?" When she realized there was no emergency, Pastor Williams' voice broke as he continued. "At first she was confused. She kept asking where the injured person was, why I had brought her to an abandoned homestead. When I started to explain about God's plan for her life, she became uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable? How?" "She started backing away from me. She said I was scaring her, that she needed to go home. But I couldn't let her leave, not until she understood what God was trying to tell her through me." Sheriff Morrison made a note on his pad. This account was beginning to deviate from the version in Pastor Williams' journal, which had portrayed Sarah Beth as simply disagreeing with his spiritual guidance. "I put my hands on her shoulders to stop her from leaving," Pastor Williams continued, tears streaming down his face. "I told her that she needed to submit to God's authority as I was expressing it to her. I said that her desire for independence was pride, and that pride was the sin that had caused Satan's fall from heaven." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. How did Sarah Beth respond to that? She became frightened. She said that I was wrong, that God would never want her to be afraid of her pastor. She said that if I didn't let her go, she would tell her parents and the church board about what I was doing. "So you killed her to keep her quiet," Margaret said, her voice flat and cold. Pastor Williams looked up sharply. "No, it wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was trying to make her understand." "Then tell me exactly what happened." Pastor Williams closed his eyes, as if he could shut out the memory by not looking at Margaret's face. "She tried to pull away from me, and I tightened my grip on her shoulders. She said that I was hurting her, that she was going to scream for help. I told her that there was no one to hear her, that God had brought us to this isolated place so we could have this conversation without interruption." Margaret waited, knowing that the worst part of the story was yet to come. Sarah Beth started to struggle more forcefully. She was a strong girl. All those years of playing sports had made her stronger than I expected. She managed to break free from my grip, but when she spun around to run away from me, she lost her balance. Pastor Williams opened his eyes and looked directly at Margaret for the first time since beginning his confession. She fell backward toward the well, Margaret. I reached out to catch her, but I was too late. She hit her head on the stone rim as she fell, and then she dropped into the well. Was she dead when she hit the water? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. I don't know, Pastor Williams whispered. I climbed down into the well as far as I could, but I couldn't reach her. I called her name over and over, but she didn't respond. There was so much blood from where she hit her head. Margaret closed her eyes, trying not to imagine her daughter's final moments of terror and pain. I should have called for help immediately, Pastor Williams continued. I should have called 911, should have tried to get emergency responders to the scene. But all I could think about was how it would look. A pastor alone in the woods with an 18-year-old girl who was now dead. So instead you decided to cover it up, Margaret said. I panicked, Pastor Williams admitted. I convinced myself that there was nothing anyone could do for Sarah Beth, that she was in God's hands now. And I told myself that destroying her, family and my ministry wouldn't bring her back. Sheriff Morrison looked up from his notes. Mr. Williams, you indicated yesterday that you had additional information to share with Mrs. Collins. Information that wasn't in your journal. Pastor Williams nodded slowly. Margaret, there's something I need to tell you about Sarah Beth's final moments. Something I've never written down because it was too painful to put into words. Margaret braced herself for whatever revelation was coming. When I was climbing down into the well trying to reach her, I heard Sarah Beth whisper something. She was barely conscious, but she was trying to speak. What did she say? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Pastor Williams' voice broke completely as he answered. She said, "Tell my mama I love her. Tell her I'm going to see Jesus now." Margaret Collins felt as if she had been struck by lightning. After 25 years of wondering whether her daughter had suffered, whether she had been afraid, whether she had thought about her family in her final moments, she finally had an answer. She wasn't angry. Pastor Williams continued through his tears. Even after what I had done, even as she was dying because of my actions, she wasn't angry. She was at peace. She knew where she was going. Margaret sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing this final piece of information. Sarah Beth's last words had been about love and faith, not fear or recrimination. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Margaret asked finally. "Because I didn't deserve to be the one to give you that comfort," Pastor Williams replied. "I was the one who took her away from you. I didn't have the right to also be the one who brought you peace about her death." Margaret looked at the broken man sitting across from her and realized that she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could hold on to the anger and hatred that she had every right to feel, or she could find a way to forgive the unforgivable. "Pastor Williams," she said quietly, "I need you to know that what you did was evil. You destroyed my family, you robbed Sarah Beth of her future, and you betrayed the trust of an entire community that looked up to you as a spiritual leader." Pastor Williams nodded, unable to speak. "But I also need you to know that I forgive you," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, "not because you deserve forgiveness, but because my daughter would want me to forgive you, because that's what she would do if she were here." Pastor Williams looked up at her in amazement. "How can you forgive me? How is that possible?" Margaret touched the cross necklace at her throat, feeling the weight of 3 generations of faith that had brought her to this moment. "Because 25 years ago, you taught me that we are all sinners in need of grace," she said. "You taught me that God's forgiveness is available even to those who seem beyond redemption. I didn't understand then that you were describing yourself, but I understand it now." Sheriff Morrison watched in amazement as Margaret Collins, a woman who had suffered more loss than most people could imagine, offered grace to the man who had caused that suffering. "Margaret," Pastor Williams whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "None of us deserve God's forgiveness," Margaret replied. "That's what makes it grace." But forgiveness doesn't mean there won't be consequences for what you've done. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and you'll have to live with the knowledge of what you took from my family." Pastor Williams nodded. "I understand. And Margaret, I want you to know that I never stopped loving Sarah Beth. What I did was wrong, it was evil, but it came from a twisted kind of love that I didn't know how to control." Margaret stood up to leave, feeling emotionally drained, but somehow lighter than she had in 25 years. "Pastor Williams, I pray that God will give you peace in your remaining years. And I pray that when your time comes to face judgment, you'll find the same grace that Sarah Beth found in her final moments." As Margaret walked out of the county jail, she felt her daughter's presence more strongly than ever. Sarah Beth was finally at peace, and now, for the first time in 25 years, so was her mother. The truth had been revealed, justice would be served, and the Collins family could finally begin to heal from wounds that had festered in darkness for far too long. Margaret Collins drove home to begin planning the funeral service that would finally bring her daughter home to rest beside her father in Millbrook Cemetery, under the shadow of the church steeple where Sarah Beth had declared her faith in Jesus Christ on the last day of her life. 6 weeks after Margaret Collins discovered her daughter's remains in the abandoned well at Cedar Hollow, the entire town of Millbrook gathered for a funeral service that had been 25 years in the making. The sanctuary of Millbrook Baptist Church was filled to capacity, with mourners spilling out into the fellowship hall and standing in the churchyard to pay their respects to Sarah Beth Collins and to support her mother through this long-awaited goodbye. Margaret had spent weeks planning every detail of the service, wanting it to reflect both the joy that Sarah Beth had experienced on her baptism day and the hope of resurrection that had sustained the Collins family through their darkest years. The sanctuary was decorated with white lilies and pink roses, Sarah Beth's favorite flowers, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting the same rainbow patterns across the walls that had blessed Sarah Beth's baptism 25 years earlier. Pastor David Hayes, who had served the church since Pastor Williams' retirement, conducted the service with sensitivity and grace. He had worked closely with Margaret to create a celebration of Sarah Beth's life that honored her memory without dwelling on the tragic circumstances of her death. "We gather today not just to mourn the loss of Sarah Beth Collins," Pastor Hayes said to the packed sanctuary, "but to celebrate a life that, though cut short, was lived with purpose, joy, and unwavering faith in Jesus Christ." Margaret sat in the front pew, wearing a black dress and Sarah Beth's silver cross necklace, which she had polished until it gleamed like new. Beside her sat Ellen Patterson and several other friends who had supported her through the long years of searching and uncertainty. The service began with the congregation singing "Amazing Grace," the same hymn that had filled the sanctuary on the day of Sarah Beth's baptism. Margaret's voice rose with the others, stronger and clearer than it had been in years, as if the weight of 25 years of uncertainty had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Pastor Hayes read from the Bible passages that had sustained Margaret through her darkest hours. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." He spoke about the mystery of suffering, the power of faith to endure even when understanding fails, and the promise of resurrection that gives meaning to every life, no matter how brief. Sarah Beth Collins lived 18 years on this earth. Pastor Hayes said, but in those 18 years, she touched countless lives with her kindness, her joy, and her unwavering faith. She was baptized in this very church on April 12, 1998, declaring her love for Jesus Christ and her commitment to follow him wherever he might lead. None of us could have known that wherever he might lead would take her home to glory that very same day. Margaret listened to the words with a mixture of grief and gratitude. For 25 years, she had wondered if Sarah Beth had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had maintained her faith even in her final moments. Pastor Williams' confession had answered those questions, revealing that Sarah Beth's last words had been about love and her confidence in eternal life. As the service continued, several people stood to share memories of Sarah Beth. Her high school teacher spoke about her intelligence and compassion. A former youth group member remembered her infectious laughter and her willingness to help anyone in need. Katie Morrison, now a mother of 3, tearfully recalled the day Sarah Beth had helped her through a crisis of faith by simply sitting with her and praying. Sarah Beth had a gift for making everyone feel loved and valued, Katie said. Through her tears, she saw the best in people, and she helped them see it in themselves. Even now, 25 years later, I try to live my life in a way that would make her proud. When it came time for Margaret to speak, she walked slowly to the pulpit where Pastor Williams had once preached, where she had heard countless sermons about faith, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways of God. The sanctuary fell completely silent as she looked out at the faces of friends and neighbors who had supported her through the longest quarter-century of her life. 25 years ago, Margaret began, her voice steady and clear, I watched my beautiful daughter come up from the baptismal waters with joy radiating from her face. I thought I was witnessing the beginning of a long and blessed life of service to God. I had no way of knowing that I was actually witnessing her final public declaration of faith before going home to be with Jesus. She paused, touching the cross necklace at her throat. For 25 years, I have struggled to understand why God would allow such a thing to happen. Why would he take my Sarah Beth on the very day she committed her life to him? Why would he allow someone we trusted to betray that trust in such a devastating way? Margaret looked directly at several church members who had been struggling with their own faith since Pastor Williams' arrest. I still don't understand God's ways completely. I probably never will. But I have learned something important during these years of searching and praying and hoping. God's plan is bigger than our understanding, and his love is stronger than our pain. She opened her Bible to a passage she had marked years earlier. In Romans 8:28, Paul tells us that, in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Notice that it doesn't say God causes all things, or that all things are good. It says that God works in all things, even the evil things, even the senseless things, to bring about good for those who love him. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. I believe that God worked even in the evil that took my Sarah Beth from us. He used my years of searching to strengthen my faith, to teach me to depend on him completely, and to show me the power of hope, even in the darkest circumstances. He used Sarah Beth's testimony, both in her life and in her death, to impact lives that we may never know about. She looked out at the young people scattered throughout the congregation. There are teenagers in this church today who have made decisions to follow Christ because they heard Sarah Beth's story. There are parents who hold their children a little closer because they learned from our loss. There are people who have found the strength to forgive the unforgivable because they watched God give me the grace to forgive, Pastor Williams. Margaret closed her Bible and stepped closer to the edge of the pulpit. I want you all to know that I have forgiven the man who took my daughter from us, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because Sarah Beth would want me to forgive, because that's what she did in her final moments. She chose love over fear, hope over despair, faith over doubt. She reached into her purse and pulled out a letter that had been delivered to her house the day before. Yesterday, I received a letter from a woman in California. She wrote to tell me that she had seen the news coverage of Sarah Beth's case, and that it had inspired her to reconcile with her own daughter after 10 years of estrangement. She said that if I could forgive Pastor Williams after 25 years of suffering, she could certainly forgive her daughter for the much smaller hurt that had divided their family. Margaret held up the letter for everyone to see. This is how God works good from evil. This is how Sarah Beth's life and death continue to bear fruit 25 years later. Every time someone chooses forgiveness over bitterness, every time someone holds on to faith in the face of suffering, every time someone loves when it would be easier to hate, Sarah Beth's testimony lives on. As Margaret returned to her seat, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. The congregation stood spontaneously and began singing, "It is well with my soul," the hymn that had become Margaret's anthem during the darkest years of her search. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. After the service, the congregation processed to Millbrook Cemetery for the burial. Sarah Beth's grave was located next to her father's, under a spreading oak tree that had been planted the year she was born. The headstone was simple and elegant, bearing her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Daughter. Her faith lights the way home." As the casket was lowered into the ground, Margaret threw a handful of dirt onto the polished wood and whispered, "Welcome home, my sweet girl. Daddy's been waiting for you." The graveside service concluded with a prayer of thanksgiving for Sarah Beth's life and a prayer for continued strength for Margaret and all who loved Sarah Beth. As people began to disperse, many stopped to hug Margaret and share final memories of her daughter. Sheriff Morrison approached Margaret as she stood beside the fresh grave, looking at the flowers that covered the mound of earth. "Mrs. Collins, I wanted you to know that Pastor Williams will be sentenced next week. With his confession and the evidence we found, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Margaret nodded. "Sheriff, I know this sounds strange, but would it be possible for me to send him a letter? There's something I want him to know." Sheriff Morrison looked surprised, but nodded. "I think that can be arranged." That evening, Margaret Collins sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter that would astonish everyone who read it. "Dear Pastor Williams, today we laid Sarah Beth to rest beside her father in Millbrook Cemetery. It was a beautiful service, filled with testimonies about the impact she had on people's lives and the faith she demonstrated even in her final moments. I want you to know that I meant what I said when I visited you in jail. I have forgiven you completely, and I pray for you daily. I pray that God will give you peace in your remaining years, and that you will find the same grace that Sarah Beth found when she went to meet Jesus. I also want you to know that even though what you did was evil, God has used it for good in ways we never could have imagined. Sarah Beth's story has touched lives around the country. Young people are choosing to follow Christ because they heard about her faithfulness. Families are reconciling because they learned about forgiveness from our experience. Churches are having important conversations about accountability and the protection of vulnerable people. This doesn't excuse what you did or minimize the pain you caused, but it does show that God's power is greater than human evil, and that His love can bring light even from the darkest circumstances. I pray that you will find peace in knowing that Sarah Beth is safe in the arms of Jesus and that her death was not meaningless. She is still bearing fruit for the kingdom of God, even from heaven. May God bless you and keep you. In Christian love, Margaret Collins. Margaret sealed the letter and placed it on her nightstand to mail the next morning. Then she walked into Sarah Beth's room, which she had decided to transform into a prayer room and memorial space where people could come to seek comfort and remember God's faithfulness even in difficult times. She knelt beside the bed where her daughter had once slept and prayed the prayer that had sustained her through 25 years of uncertainty. Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing my Sarah Beth home to me, and thank you for the assurance that she has been with you all these years. Thank you for giving me the strength to forgive and the faith to believe that you work all things together for good. Help me to use the rest of my life to honor Sarah Beth's memory and to point others toward the hope that we have in you. And Lord, please watch over Pastor Williams in prison. Help him to find genuine repentance and peace in his remaining years. Let Sarah Beth's story continue to bear fruit in ways we can't imagine, and let her light continue to shine until you come again. In Jesus' precious name, amen. As Margaret rose from her knees, she felt a peace that had eluded her for 25 years. Sarah Beth was home, both in the Millbrook Cemetery beside her father and in the presence of Jesus, where she had been all along. The search was over, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. Margaret Collins walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the mountains where she had found her daughter's cross at the bottom of an ancient well. Tomorrow, people would begin arriving from around the country. People who had been touched by Sarah Beth's story and wanted to visit the place where faith had triumphed over evil and forgiveness had overcome hatred. Margaret would welcome them, all sharing the story of how a young woman's baptism became her passage to glory, and how her mother's refusal to give up hope had ultimately revealed the truth and brought healing to a wounded community. As she prepared for bed, Margaret touched the silver cross at her throat and whispered the words that had become her nightly prayer. "Good night, Sarah Beth. I'll see you in the morning. If not tomorrow's morning, then in the eternal morning when Jesus calls us all home." Outside her window, the church bells of Millbrook Baptist began to toll the midnight hour, their bronze voices echoing across the valley, where a mother's love had finally brought her daughter home, and where faith had proven stronger than the grave. 25 years after Sarah Beth Collins disappeared on the day of her baptism, her story had become a testament to the power of unwavering faith, persistent love, and the mysterious ways in which God works even the darkest circumstances together for good. And in the mountains of Tennessee, where an ancient well had guarded its secret for a quarter of a century, the silver cross that had led a grieving mother to the truth continued to catch the light. A symbol of hope, that death is not the end, that love never fails, and that God's plan includes even the broken places of our lives. Margaret Collins slept peacefully that night for the first time in 25 years, knowing that her daughter was finally home where she belonged, and that their story of loss and redemption would continue to bring hope to hurting hearts for generations to come. The baptism that had begun Sarah Beth's eternal life had also begun a journey of faith for her mother, a journey that had led through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged into the light of God's unshakable love. In Millbrook, Tennessee, the church bells still ring every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship and remember that even in the darkest circumstances, God's light still shines. And in the cemetery beside the church, two graves rest side by side under the spreading oak tree. Father and daughter reunited at last, their earthly journey complete, their eternal story just beginning. Sarah Beth Collins had come home.